This video is going to show you how to make a butterfly knife that's fancier than the last one I made, and it also features a lock, and this is a new type of lock that I invented just for this project. I was planning on making a butterfly machete, but it didn't turn out so well, so we're going with this instead. Start with a piece of stock metal and measure out how long you want the knife handles to be. Now cut one of the handles to be about 5 inches long and cut the rest of them to be the same length as this one. Now round the ends and the edges with a bench grinder. I used a cutoff wheel on a table saw to remove some of the metal on both ends of the handle, that way the brass inlays would lay flush with the rest of the handle. Next, drill a hole in a thin piece of wood. Now mark on the handles where you want your hole and then line up that mark with the hole you drilled in the piece of wood and then clamp it together with vice grip pliers. Now the drill bit will stay in the hole you drilled in the piece of wood, which is clamped to the metal, so you'll actually drill the hole where you want it. Then use the vice grip pliers with wood as a buffer so you don't put dents in the middle, and line up both handles so that you can drill through one handle into the other to make absolutely certain that it's lined up. Drilling holes in metal usually puts splinters coming out the back of the holes, so I would recommend grinding that off and then sanding each handle before you put the brass inlays in. It doesn't have to be brass, you can use copper or whatever you want, but I use brass because that's what I had. Now cut grooves in the handles for the brass inlays to go in. Now use some sheet metal cutters to cut out the inlays and bend it at a bit of an angle at the end. To get the inlays in the right spot, clamp the inlays down to the handle and then drill through the handle into the brass. It's easier to cut the brass into shape before it's attached to the knife, because it's held in place with the pin that holds the entire knife together. So you're going to want to put the pin through the handle and the piece of brass and then bolt it down with some vice grip pliers so it stays in place exactly where it's going to be on the finished knife, and then just grind it off until it's flush with the outside of the knife. Make sure you grind at an angle so you're pushing the brass plate into the knife. If you push it out of the knife, it will bend upward and you'll have to hammer it back down again. The inlays should be attached with rivets. I actually used super glue and it didn't work very well. The ones at the end of the handle are long enough to have 2 pins going in each. One of those rivets goes through both handles and one just goes through the inlay and the handle itself just to hold the inlay in place. Trace the outline of your knife blade on a piece of metal and make sure it will line up with the pins in the handles. Now use a rotary saw with a cutoff wheel to cut out your knife blade. I cut it out of a table saw blade because it was pretty good steel. I decided to make this knife more decorative and gave it a fancy looking shape, but you can do whatever you want for yours. Now smooth out the back of the blade to make sure it doesn't cut you when you're flipping it. Now grind down the end of the blade if it was too long to fit inside the handles correctly, and if it isn't, you can start sharpening the blade. Now you can use the same method from earlier to drill a hole in the blade. You should have lined up the blade with the handles to see where the other pin needs to go and then drilled a hole in the other side, so there's now 2 holes in the blade. Drill another hole in a piece of saw blade and then sketch your lock around it. Then you can start cutting out the lock. Since it has the center hole already, you can cut out the general shape of the lock and then put it in the knife and see where it's supposed to line up before cutting out the finer details. I decided to give the blade a decorative touch and drew a line down the side of it just to make it look fancier. It didn't end up going very well, but I just used a rotary tool for it in case anyone wanted to do that. To smooth it out, I used a cutoff wheel, and then cut 3 notches in the back of the blade just because it looked cool. I also ground down the back of the blade to make it a little bit smoother and also to make it look cooler. While doing any work on a sharpened blade, you definitely want to wedge it between some vice grip pliers, that way it doesn't go flying off into something. Before you actually install the blade of the knife, you're going to want to smooth it all out with some sandpaper. After you've decided how the handles are going to be assembled, you can cut out a couple pins and start putting together the lock mechanism to see where everything lines up, and then start grinding down the lock to make it line up with the pins correctly. After you've finished cutting out the lock, use a grinding wheel to smooth it out and also to taper in the edges so it slides in between the handles easier. Use bolt cutters to make 5 pins, which are each long enough to go through both inlays, both handles, and the blade that's sandwiched in between, and still have about 2 millimeters left over outside to be hammered down. Assemble the entire knife to make sure everything fits together because it's a lot easier to grind the pieces into the correct shape when they're not attached to each other. After you know all the pieces fit together, you can start assembling it again with paper spacers in between and then start hammering it together. You may also want to shove one of the teeth of the saw blade you cut your blade out of between the handles to make sure that gap doesn't get any smaller than the width of your blade. On the other side, where there are 2 pins, wedge a piece of metal on each side of the pins to make sure you don't smash it too much so the lock can't fit, and then just hammer both pins until they're flush on both sides so it's actually holding it together. The last 2 things you have to do are install the tang pins. What you're going to want to do for this part is to drill a hole in a piece of wood, then put a toothpick through that hole, line up the toothpick with where you want the hole to be on the knife. You're going to want to line it up so it goes through both handles and the blade. So make sure the blade is absolutely straight when you do this because wherever you put this hole, it's going to line up the blade from now on. So now the hole in the piece of wood is in line with the gap between both handles and part of the blade. So when you drill a hole through the wood, both handles and through the blade, it will line up, and then you can just put a pin in and it'll hold the blade perfectly straight. So one of these drills, you're going to have the blade open and both handles together on that side, and for the other cut, you're going to have the knife closed. Both times I would recommend locking the knife. If you did like me and left almost no gap between the ends of the handles, you're going to have to start your drill, then put the drill bit through the blade, and then rotate both handles around so it cuts off excess metal so that when there is a tang pin in the blade, it can actually rotate. If you don't do this, it will probably stick, unless you happen to make the ends of the handle small enough to begin with. After that, you can install the tang pins. To do this, I just used vice grip pliers. I got it to exactly the length of the pin and smashed it, and then cranked it a little tighter and smashed it again, and kept doing that until the pin was actually stuck in the knife. You may find it easier to install the pins using super glue. If you want to do this, just put glue around the outside of the pin on one end, and then push it through so the glue gets stuck on the blade, and then add more glue on the opposite side. And that's pretty much it. Just think about how everything's going to line up in the end, and you should be fine.